Hello, everybody. Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Gigaohm Biological can be followed at stream.gigaohm.bio, where you can find all of our videos archived, as well as interesting archived in the Batcave, and a mirror of some of Housatonic Live, Mark Kulak's recent work, can also be found at stream.gigaohm.bio. That's our own website maintained by me. Mark does contribute monthly, as do a lot of other people. And it is maintained by myself and a follower and supporter by the name of Ted. Gigaohm.bio is our soapbox communication location. You can have conversations with fellow Ohmies there, if you will. And you can also have conversation with me there if you want to. And finally, at gigaohmbiological.com, you can find ways to support the stream, another archive there. And that's kind of maybe the best way to share our work, because there all the other links can be easily found. Thank you very much for joining me. February 4th, 2025, the voice that you're listening to right now on YouTube, Rumble, PeerTube, and Twitch is that of Jonathan JJCouey. You can find the work that I did as an academic biologist on PubMed by using my last name, Couey, and my first initials, J and J. Thank you very much for joining me. I will see you in a few minutes.
By about 1660, John Locke wrote that day laborers and tradesmen, spinsters and dairymaids must be told what to believe. The greatest part cannot know, and therefore they must believe.
Now, Dr. Gallo and Dr. Fauci talked a lot about isolation and purification. Can you tell me what the difference is between the two?
Isolation, what was it?
Isolation and purification.
Of the virus?
Yes.
Well, you isolate a virus by finding the virus which causes a disease. You purify a virus by making just by purifying it so you get a pure virus. I don't understand what the issue.
They interchange the two, and I wasn't sure if it was the same thing or if it was two totally different.
No, it depends on how they use it.
Okay. Can you explain the process of HIV isolation?
Well, didn't Dr. Gallo do that? I mean, he actually isolated it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, why should I do all of this? This is all textbook stuff you're asking me.
Stop lying!
It doesn't matter much at all what you believe about vaccines until we invent really important ones.
Stop lying!
Until we have a pandemic that's killing everyone.
Stop lying!
It's measles plus. Okay, I can tolerate what you think about measles because, not that many people die from it. It's just a big hassle in the end. But no, when we have this new pandemic that is, got 75% mortality, and there'll be no pretense of being polite in the face of these beliefs. It'll be a moral emergency because it has to be.
It's literally turning into worst case scenario.
The latest data tells us that we're dealing with essentially a worst case scenario.
Turning into worst case scenario.
I'm afraid that the latest data tells us that we're dealing with.
But you can tell if someone's lying. You can sort of feel it in people. And I have lied. I'm sure I'll lie again. I don't want to lie. I don't think I'm a liar. I try not to be a liar. I don't want to be a liar. I think it's really important not to be a liar.
I think truth is good for kids. We're so busy lying, we don't even recognize the truth no more in society. We want everybody to feel good. That's not the way life is.
Follow the rules, protect yourself at all times. Follow my instructions. Keep it clean, touch gloves if you wish, let's do it.
Sweaty palms.
This is so crazy. Like goosebumps. This is so crazy. I feel so nervous. Like, what in the world, man?
introduce Jonathan, who's going to talk about his latest kind of distillation of what the pandemic means to society, to biology, to science, and to democracy, and to the whole kind of idea of empiricism and integrity. And then each of us, this incredible preeminent panel that we have, each one of you is going to get a chance to comment.
I don't care how you get there. I don't care what you do to get there. The goal is to win.
What time is it? Game time! Boom!
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are on this little planet. Welcome to the show. This is Gigaohm Biological. We are definitely living in interesting times, and we're trying to be like Galileo, not, as cool as him, but we're trying to be one of the few people that stands up and dances when appropriate, stands up and says no when appropriate. We're trying to occupy our own consciousness as much as we can and not allow the thoughts that are in it to be dictated by social media, which is their way of controlling our conscious thoughts. Because it's not a matter of what is true, it's a matter of what is perceived to be true. And of course, that's what this show is all about. We're not in charge of trying to make people understand what's wrong with the monetary system, although there is some very big things wrong with it. We're trying to get people to read books again. We're trying to get people to critically think again about big ideas in biology that have become assumptions. And those assumptions are still codified in a sort of weird history that we can still tap into as a way and a means of escape. But only people who can see or see when shown can go inside of these old libraries and find stuff that's useful to us. Because again, there is only one chance in history, this one right here, where there's a 10 billion human population. That's a lot of games of Go. That's a lot of games of chess to feed their AI, and they know that. So it is now that they are manipulating the minds of our children to get them in on the idea that they should be online all the time, that they should let their limited spectrum of understanding be fully controlled by social media. And if we don't pull our kids out, no one will, because this spectacular commitment to lies, this ain't ending. You think this is gonna end, you got another thing coming. It's far from ending. A spectacular commitment to lies is in fact what all of these people have essentially been demonstrating during their auditions, during the promotion, or let's say cautionary promotion of their podcast. They have had to stick to a limited spectrum of debate, and the better they've done, the more they've risen. And there have been people in the position to control the narrative from the very beginning. And it is in their 5-year track record plus that you can see the spectacular commitment to lies, because they don't learn anything. Their position doesn't really change, and they got most of the stuff right seemingly very early in the pandemic. And that spectacular commitment to lies includes cross-promotion of these various members of Team Robert Malone and Team Kevin McKernan. It includes cross-promotion of different groups and organizations as if they're not already sabotaged. And the only way out is to get rid of these fake banners, get rid of these fake groups, and start assembling by responsible adult to responsible adult, and assembling communities of people who are willing to learn the biology and willing to identify with the hard work, who are playing against us. This is probably the only hope we have. We have to understand our history. We have to understand how we got here. That's going to require work on everybody's part. Those are exercises that nobody can do for you. You're going to need a coach here, but you're still going to have to read the things that need reading. You're going to have to download and archive the things that need to be downloaded and archived so that you and your kids and your kids' kids can never have this history taken away from you. Because the reason why we are under the power of these charlatans is because we inherited this situation from our parents. And we, as the adults that we are, have the opportunity to not give this to our kids. This time it could be different. We don't have to hand over our children to the mythology that these people have created. We don't have to hand it down to them. We could instead hand down the truth. And it is every day I start my show by asking all the smart people out there in the world that see it, all the people that get this slide shared with them, to think very carefully about how they might be able to disprove these statements, that intramuscular injection of any combination of substances with the intent of augmenting the immune system is dumb, that transfection of healthy humans was always criminal, and that RNA cannot pandemic, and therefore the U.S. vaccine schedule is a criminal enterprise just because of the biology upon which it supposedly is based. Never mind the legal shield that they have in our legislative structure that prevents any meaningful resistance to a mandate or to a school mandate or to even just the funding of these things. But more importantly, it is the intellectual basis of vaccination in general, especially intramuscular vaccination, that we can stand firm against if we understand the biology. And so that's what Gigaohm Biological is attempting to do. And I think there are other people trying to do it as well. I think Mark Husatonic of Husatonic ITS, Husatonic Live, is trying very hard to spread the biology. And more importantly for me, what I see Mark doing is working to try and make some sense of the way that these ideas were passed down from mentor to mentor, from CEO to CEO, from funder to CEO and back. We all want to understand, I think, in the end, who misled us. And I think that work is only being done by people like Mark Kulak and myself. No one else really cares who taught Robert Malone. No one really cares who worked with Robert Malone or how closely the mentors of Robert Malone and Judy Mikovits might have been connected by Tony Fauci and Peter and Robert Gallo, for example. Nobody wants to talk about Sina Bavari and all the people that he's connected to and mentored. Nobody wants to talk about any of these very, very pertinent topics. And I think that's the reason why we've got to keep doing the work here at Gigaohm Biological. I think that's why you got to keep sharing this work, especially this live work now that we're testing the boundaries of YouTube and daring them essentially to give us their seal of approval that this is information that is dangerous to the narrative. Of course, maybe my fancy graphics and all my nice colors make it very impossible for them to do that, because maybe, just maybe, whoops, sorry about that, that maybe they don't take it seriously. You know, maybe if I put Star Trek ears on and pretended I was on the Star Trek Enterprise, I could also say anything I want to. At this stage, I'm afraid that there's some kink in their armor where they can't afford to call attention to me or validate my work in any way. And so they're going to allow me to live stream. They're going to keep allowing me to live stream. And so that means you can keep sharing it. Gigaohm Biological wants you to understand. I want you to understand this. I say Gigaohm Biological, but that's really just me and my family with 3 kids and a wife, and our garage. And we have a very simple message. This is for all the marbles. It's for all the grandchildren on Earth. And it is a limited time during which we can still save our children from this, where they can be really brought to understand how this illusion was created using social media and a chorus, a malevolent harmony of liars on social media. that was singing in a very malevolent harmony with the nonsense on television, that completely bamboozled us for almost 2.5 years about what was happening and how we might detect it. They essentially tricked us into using their tools to identify their ghosts and then patted us on the back for feeling like Ghostbusters. And what they did was they took a background signal, however specific you would like to be about it, is up to the crime investigative team when we actually investigate this correctly. But a background noise of inestimable proportions was very simply converted into evidence of, misconstrued into evidence of a novel spreading pathogen using non-specific PCR tests. Story over. And so even the pivot of the no virus people in the last couple days to now saying that, ooh, wow, PCR to detect cancer, that's lame, that's lame. They still haven't adequately explained this in a simple enough manner so that anyone that hears the explanation would understand it. And now they're zeroing in on a cancer vaccine campaign is just going along with the narrative. It's exactly the hamster wheel rung that we're on right now. And instead of very deftly connecting it back to the original lie, like I've been trying to do, which is that the non-specific PCR test, the whole nature of PCR tests being specific only makes sense on the bench of an academic biologist that gets wiped down by alcohol every day, that has racks of sterile plastic workwear, and has boxes of rubber gloves around. The idea of a PCR as a very specific diagnostic in a medical scenario with medical samples is absurd. And no one that was trying to object to the pandemic at the beginning of it was able to say this out loud. Instead, the no virus people focused on there is no virus and isolation, purification, and culture, and the definition of these words, and FOIAs. Or we were focused on the keeping down of repurposed drugs, which reinforces the idea of a novel spreading pathogen, a cover-up of a lab leak. No one effectively resisted the PCR test, and in fact, the most outspoken resistors of the PCR test remain people that are in front of us now, and they did not object to the use of PCR in general. Like I would say, PCR as a diagnostic is a fraud. They are medical devices that are under the purview of FDA regulation. And so without the pandemic, and without all of these people obfuscating the absolute fraud that the PCR testing was by assuming there was a virus because we all had something strange in 2020, they have gone on to say that the shot is bad, the shot is bad, the shot is bad. Let's not talk about 2020, and this is why. Because the PCR test was used to cover murder. The PCR test was used to create the entity that we are now supposedly dealing with as a now endemic reality. And so the way out is the truth. They used placebo to make the transfection safe. That's why they had people, also part of Team Robert Malone and Kevin McKernan, they had people in place to talk about hot batches. And they had people talking about how it might be whether or not they were kept at -80. When all along they knew, and everybody else that works in pharma knew, that buying 2 billion doses of something was absurd. But if they were allowed to package a significant portion as placebo just to get the whole thing rolling, just to make sure that the rollout would definitely be perceived as safe and any injuries could be misconstrued as very rare, they had a team of people out there saying hot batch and not hot batches and trying to do, different correlations with different batches and different colors and publishing these papers in weird journals using the data that they get from the pharmaceutical companies themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, using their test to find their ghost does not make their ghost real, nor does it make you a ghostbuster. Understand that no one else that's been in front of you for the last 5 years can explain the pandemic with a single slide, and that's because they are not telling the truth. They are part of, wittingly or unwittingly, the maintenance of this narrative, this mystery virus. Something needs to be solved because, again, the overclass has placed people in front of you, manipulated your habits, manipulated your opinions, controlled the questions you asked, and tricked you into believing that there was a lab leak that was being covered up. A lab leak that was being covered up, and that meant a novel virus. And the way to break out of that mystery-solving exercise, that enchantment, is to understand the biology that edifies these statements. PCR is not a useful diagnostic tool. Pure oxygen causes ARDS, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome. Not using antibiotics for pneumonia is a crime and murder. It's malpractice. So that if you understand the truth of these three statements, then you can understand how murder and lies were misconstrued as spread of a novel pathogen using nonspecific PCR. Now, the most important thing to see here that very few of us have been saying is that there seems to be an effort to invert our sovereignty to animal testing status. And at some point, I started to understand it as a population math problem. Because all of the calculations, all of the population pyramids that you put together suggest that the world population as it now stands at 9 billion people is not going to sustain itself at 9 billion people. It's not going to grow much anymore. It might grow to 10 billion before we eventually have quite a big collapse because our population pyramids are kind of inverted. We have a lot of old people from this large period of time after World War II where a lot of families in Western nations had a lot of kids and a lot of those kids lived. If you go back 100 years or 200 years, then big families have a lot of kids, but those kids die as they age. They don't all make it to 80. And so the population pyramid looks a bit like a pyramid. But as Western nations and Western medicine and Western sanitation and Western nutrition went up, then the population pyramid starts to go like this because the old people live longer, right? And so that was an understood phenomenon. It's an understood problem. And the thing that we now are dealing with, the thing that was taken advantage of, was the shape of our population pyramid and a known rise in all-cause mortality that needed to be managed or would have probably bankrupted a lot of Western nations. Now, if you combine that with what I've got behind me right now, which is that the Human Genome Project was always a mythology, a plan of what to do, a first-pass effort to see if we could do it with 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 genomes, make a map. And were there any correlations between those maps that might be construed as useful so that we would have an excuse to make these kinds of restriction enzyme maps for everybody that we could get our hands on? And already at the start of the finishing of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins and Mark Lander and the Research and Development Director, Kevin McKernan, already knew that sampling everyone's genome was the only way that any of this plan would ever work. Just like playing a few games of chess or a few games of Go and then putting them into an AI would never be enough data in order for an AI to see any meaningful pattern in the outcomes. And so couple that with the fact that when the Human Genome Project was completed in 2003 or 5 or whenever they announced it, they didn't have the computing power. They didn't have the computer storage. They didn't have the electronic means by which the data set that they imagined they needed to collect could even be stored in a useful way so that computing power, it could be dumped through the processing computing power of some heretofore non-existent computer. But we are now at the stage, after 5 years of this mystery-solving exercise, where has been established by default that PCR as a viral diagnostic is useful. And hospitals all around the world, and in particular in America, because that's where I live, are using PCR as a viral diagnostic and thereby creating a whole stream of remnants that can be sold to the highest bidder for disease marker screening or even whole genome screening. And I would argue that at the beginning of the pandemic, that was already well known, and that's why there are a few lawsuits that started in 2020 or 21 where big colleges already had buyers set up for their remnant stream. They were going to test their students every week, and they were selling those swabs. All the negative swabs were still valuable to them. Think about that for a minute. Those weren't going somewhere to sequence the virus. Those weren't being sent to DITRA. They were being sent somewhere else, to some higher bidder. And some faculty found out about it. Some faculty blew the whistle. I don't know where those cases are anymore. But what you see is that the dream remnant stream has been established, where, again, PCR can be used as a diagnostic. And PCR, first and foremost, requires the chemical preservation of all of the genetic signals in the sample. So you take that swab and then you put it in a chemical concoction that preserves the DNA and RNA that you catch. It's the perfect remnant stream. And this has been accomplished for the slavers by the team worst case scenario. These people who came out very early and told us stories about the spike protein and about gain of function and about lab leak, or unwittingly went along with those stories and those wild goose chases, those hamster wheels, until we've gotten to 2025 and nobody seems to realize that one of the worst outcomes of the pandemic is that we have come to accept as a medical system PCR as a viral diagnostic, and there currently exist medical devices on the market that purport to be able to identify up to 17 different targets, different viruses. And the FDA should be regulating those medical devices. The FDA should be regulating those medical devices. The FDA should be regulating those medical devices, except for the fact that they passed through the pandemic and were basically given default approval. And all of these people know that. That's why they have organized our habits and opinions around it without questioning it. We can question the COVID shots. We can question whether it was a natural virus or a laboratory leak. But we can't question how it's detected, how it's monitored, or how it's sequenced. We must accept that as fact. That's why Kevin McKernan, the Research and Development Director of the Human Genome Project, has been involved in the curation of this narrative on the internet since 2020. That's why Edward Bernays and Noam Chomsky warned us in these specific ways, because it is as simple and as complicated as this. Coordinated liars. And if we allow our children to interact with one another and interact with their world and to experience their real-time history through social media, it's going to be really game over. They're enslaved. We've got to get them off of social media, because it is on social media, like the Danny Jones podcast, where people like this are allowed to go and tell stories, tell complete fabrications that can be verifiably falsified by living, breathing people. This same guy has been messing with me for about 3.5 years, 4 years on social media. It can be seen no other way. This multimillionaire has been meddling with a family that rents their house in Pittsburgh. That's the real news in America. That's the real news in America. that there are a couple patriots, a couple three patriots in the world of American internet that are actually just American patriots, that are just doing what they think they have to do in order to spread the truth of what's happening in America before we are permanently fractured on mythologies and nonsense and fairy tales. We are about 3 acts away from arguing about where the aliens came from. And so the vaccine schedule is a criminal enterprise, and that is the reason why Robert Malone and Meryl Nass and Mary Holland and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Kevin McKernan and Kevin McCairn and Charles Rixey and Doc Malik and Nick Hudson and all the no virus people and all the people like Tony Fauci and Peter Daszak, and who was on 60 Minutes with George Webb on 60 Minutes. And all these are part of the same show. They might not know how they're all part of the same show, probably because they use the same show to make sure that they always have a very friendly audience. Can you imagine if you were propping up a comedian and he was not a very good comedian, but you didn't want him to know it? You'd have to constantly curate his audience. But interestingly, that's very easy to do on social media. And Brett Weinstein might not know he's had a heckler in the audience for the last 3 years because they keep that very clear out of his stream. Many of these people may have been insulated from any useful critique of them. And that may have been necessary to pull this off, to make sure that these people were bamboozled into never actually understanding and saying this before it was useful to them. But I've been saying it for a couple years now, ever since that I got clubbed in the face with it in 2022. But these myths are perpetuated by traitors who are hiding murder with lies, because people were murdered in 2020, 2021, and 2022 by supplementary oxygen and remdesivir and midazolam and a lack of antibiotics for simple things like urinary tract infections and pneumonia. And they had to do that because, again, there was a population pyramid problem that needed managing, that they've seen coming for decades. Remember, men on one side, females on the other, ages from 0 to 4 all the way up to 100. And so you can display any population like this. If I just pause it here at 2004, this is the whole population of the United States, 292 million people, distributed over these age groups and these sexes. And so if we let this go, you can see clearly that we're going to have a problem here because, again, Western medicine, Western nutrition, Western pharmaceuticals, yada, 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 has allowed a lot more people to survive. Big families of 12 weren't big families of 6 at age 50. They're big families of 11 at age 50. And so as this gets higher and higher and these people age out, they retire and they become wardens of the state medically. And that's the problem. The math of this is the problem. That's why Fauci knew in 2017 that we would have a challenge. It was guaranteed we'd have a challenge in the Trump administration. That's why Trump went along with it. You don't think that the people in the highest meetings are briefed on the fact that we have an expected all-cause rise? Sorry, we're going to have a expected rise in all-cause mortality, and the Department of Defense and our 17 intelligence agencies are going to use this expected all-cause mortality rise to create a controllable crisis that we can use to adjust a few things in our legal system, that we can adjust a few things in our political system, and so that we can convince the next generation in America to understand themselves more as part of a community, and feel some indebtedness to it, so that we can require them to turn over all of their genetic and medical information. And before the population of the Earth is curbed back down to around 2 billion, we will have all of the infrastructure, including the data storage and AI capabilities, to store all of this data as these populations age out and we transition into the sort of new world order where a lot of these Western nations will collapse. Thank you, sir. That's how this is going to happen. That's likely the kind of, briefing that you have with Giordano on the outside briefing. And then when you get into the main meeting, that's what they say. Okay, so here's the deal. This is what we're going to tell people. It's just like the idea that Event 201 is on YouTube still, and therefore it's evidence that they knew it was a lab leak or something like that. No, the real evidence that they know that this is nonsense is that the real Event 201 that Mark Husatonic has archived existed, but is nowhere on the internet. Nowhere are those presentations available where Dr. Sapphire or Dr. Lee Minyan or Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett are presenting their respective expertises. Scary place we are, ladies and gentlemen, a very scary place we are because, again, you got to ask yourself, have they already eliminated the control group? How many old people do you know were successful in not taking any shots? I know a guy at my gym, I've told you this story before, who did not take the COVID shot, but took a shingles shot and then it wrecked him. Also an mRNA. So we have a very, very big problem on our hands, ladies and gentlemen, because even if it's not an mRNA vaccine, the whole idea of vaccinating old people, challenging their immune system or challenging their bodies in general with an intramuscular injection of a combination of substances, toxins and proteins, with the intent of augmenting their immune system that got them that far. It's very, very strange, ladies and gentlemen. We have to be very, very careful because the people who are no longer in the control group will have a very hard time waking up to this, understanding how screwed they are. My friend Nathan, for example, and his family still are not aware. Despite the fact that they lost Nathan, they're still not really aware of the fact. They can't really internalize the fact that it could happen to them in 10 years. And certainly if they keep transfecting themselves, the odds go up. It's hard to, there is no way to estimate it. Transfection was a crime. It's that simple. It's just dumb. Intramuscular injection of medicine is dumb. And so in a lot of ways, I'm not part of the control group either because I've had intramuscular injection of a combination of substances with the intent of augmenting my immune system like you have. But we're not like the children at my kids' school. We're definitely not like the children at my kids' school. We're not like the old people in old folks' homes. We're not like college kids, which is pretty scary to say. And so there really is only one chance for them to do this, right? You got to get your time horizon long enough so that you see how these people are planning and what world they're planning to hand over to their children. This has been the plan since Joshua Lederberg explained it before he even understood how it all be done. And just one time for the cheap sheets, they lied to us about a mystery virus that was responsible for excess deaths that they already knew were coming. All they had to do was sweep them into a little sharper peaks so that they could sound the alarm about them. And they swept them into sharper peaks by, number one, lying to you about the real all-cause mortality in America every day, which fluctuates between 50,000 and 60,000 or 70,000 people every week. And they lied to you about how people died. And they lied to you about the effectiveness of supplementary oxygen. Never corrected anyone or any hospital system that was using supplementary oxygen because they didn't have enough ventilators. Never corrected anyone for using ventilators to stop spread. Never corrected anyone for saying that pneumonia could be viral and therefore antibiotic resistant. No use using antibiotics on a viral pneumonia, says TWIV and the CDC. No evidence of spread is a secret that was very coolly kept by Denny Rancor, even after he met every one of the heroes in Romania in 2023 over breakfast at the hotel. He still didn't bother to come back to North America and correct them and remind them that there's no epidemiological evidence of spread, and he's seen that since May 2020. We also don't have any lawyers that will usefully discuss any of these terms. That includes, most appropriately, I think, Mary Holland, Aaron Seary, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It's just unfortunate. And there's if you can find a lawyer who actually understands this, they will be able to confirm that I'm 100% right. They don't talk about strict liability in a precise and useful way in reference to either the laws that we are under or the principles that are being violated, and they don't talk about strict scrutiny and what that term means in reference to American law, what that would mean in terms of any of these particular laws that have to do with vaccines, and how strict scrutiny would or would not be in that law, how it give an example of how it might be in that law or not in that law. They will not touch it because, again, these two legal principles are real. These two legal principles, if applied correctly, would eliminate our problem. That's the truth. And that's the reason why all of these hamster wheels, all of these limited spectrums of debate where everybody's getting real fired up or arguing with each other are irrelevant, because all of the murder is listed here and they've never discussed it. All of the incongruent biology is stated right here in 5 words and they've never discussed it. And all of the legal issues can be codified basically with those 2 phrases and how they expand, and they won't touch it. And so here you can see a CDC provided data graph of the murder. What you see here is basically the baseline in red, and if you go back many years, it's pretty much like that the whole time. And then somehow in 2019, we just start at the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020, we just forgot how to treat pneumonia. We forgot how to stop the spread of something in hospitals, and we started using ventilators to do it. We stopped using supplementary oxygen with any nuance because of a panic that was created by an illusion of consensus on TV and social media that there was a novel virus spreading that required novel treatments because it was a novel, strange disease. And that lie was sustained long enough to murder people for almost 3 years.
Where are you? We got some work to do now.
And I was tricked by the Scooby-Doo mystery. I thought I was solving it. I threw my research career in the garbage can, thinking that it was more important than ever to make people understand how likely it was that this was a lab leak. I was played like a fiddle. And it's for all the marbles. They'll play anybody they need to, and anybody that plays the fiddle tune that they wanted played, they got promoted. They gave them a podcast. Rumble might even come to your house and build you a set. And so I want you to see it for what it is. That if you see where these people spoke out in 2021 or 2022, all the murder was over. They had already run out the clock, and then they ran it out until 2025 without really learning anything or progressing in their understanding, just giving everybody a microphone and not really deciding whether some people are full of it and some people got it or not. Instead, just everybody goes up to the mic and says what they want to say, and then at the end, it's just like, okay, thanks, everybody. Just like the NCI in Canada. If any of these processes actually worked, then the best ideas would be siphoned off the top and put in a summary or in a billboard that this is what the committee learned after listening to all these people. Let's summarize it in 2 pages. You know, Gigaohm Biological can summarize it in a couple slides, but that's okay. These people have Substacks to write. And so today we're talking about none other than Brett Weinstein, one of my personal little clown cars that has been bamboozling or part of bamboozling me for a long time. And also, quite frankly, I'm very thankful for the fact that it has been Brett Weinstein, because he has also been almost a soloist in terms of the voices in the wilderness that I hear and realize are completely fake. He has been the best example of me trying to convince someone of a biological idea or a set of biological ideas and realizing that I can't teach someone who isn't actively trying to learn, but is instead actually trying to steal. Now, the other people that were involved in this Signal chat group are listed here, and I will say unequivocally that because it's 2025 and they've had plenty of time to email or call, that all of these people are definitely in on it, wittingly or unwittingly. They are part of this team worst case scenario, which was put in place to absolutely keep the bullshit level high enough so that they could murder people for 2 years straight and establish the existence of a novel virus, the existence of a pandemic, the existence of a future pandemics, the trackability of pandemics by PCR, and the albeit rushed and flawed countermeasure of transfection being, a vaccine like no other, as this guy said. Now, again, here's where the murder is, right? So if you look at where the murder was, look at where I am. I joined them during the third wave of murder already. I had already written my Scooby-Doo review, which he says, upon meeting me on Signal, he thought it was spot on. But that biology has never been expounded on by Brett Weinstein, except for to say one time on a couch with Robert Malone, I think I came up with this idea on my own.
If you want to move from...
Remember yesterday we talked about how Mary Holland was on the War Room with Steve Bannon, and she very deftly spun all, just completely ignored all the weird statements that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. made while he was in front of the Senate, including, I support vaccines, I support the childhood vaccine schedule, I want to protect the childhood vaccine schedule, I want children to get vaccines, vaccines save children's lives. He basically said all of those things, or maybe a slight variation of them, during those 2 days in front of the Senate. Now, you could see that, and Mary would spin that as him just playing political. Him just doing what he needs to do to get confirmed, and once he gets confirmed, he's gonna, blow all the bridges and everything is gonna be fine. He's gonna go full in on the agenda, and I would say that that's very unlikely to happen. More importantly, what I think is extraordinary about Mary Holland being in the same room as Steve Bannon in 2025, the day of these hearings, is that Mark Kulak has managed, as far as I know, the only guy who's managed to kind of put Steve Bannon in the proper place in this narrative, where in January 25th, 2020, he was saying lab leak. In January, he was having Stephen Hatfill on his War Room show. It's really crazy that Paul Cottrell was originally calling his little stream the War Room, and Paul Cottrell, of course, is intimately connected with George Webb, who was on 60 Minutes and cited by Robert Malone as the main meddler behind him and sued and whatever. It's bizarre because it really appears to be all one network, especially now if you see Mary Holland and Steve Bannon talking about CHD, calling Robert F. Kennedy Jr. the founder of an organization that somebody named Laura Bono actually founded, that this woman has very deftly stepped in front of. and quietly allowed to retire. Did anyone else know that Laura Bono founded the organization, that she's the one that waited on Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s doorstep with a box full of papers until he finally decided to read them, and then when he did, he started the organization with her? And she just retired at the end of last year, right before the election. You don't think that they should have some kind of thank you on their website, or had some kind of memorial, or not memorial, but like greatest hits of Laura Bono? No. That's not how this works. That's not what this organization is about. This organization is sabotage, and it's been sabotaged by a few people at the very top. There are lots of autism moms that work there that really believe in what they're doing, and a lot of times maybe it seems like they're doing something good. But when you listen to Mary in this, she says innovation, she says AI, and she thinks all of those things are great. She's talking about getting around the FDA, that the FDA is in the way, essentially, without saying it. Very similar to all these other people. What's really interesting is Brett Weinstein's take, because I have known Brett Weinstein for a long time.
Proper way to deal with this.
I have known Brett Weinstein for a long time. As I showed you, I joined a Signal chat with him in August of 2021 when I thought he was a good guy and that I could teach him about transfection and why we needed to call it transfection in order for there to be any semblance of informed consent. That was what we were talking about in August of 2021. And he just didn't go with it. He didn't say it. He didn't say transfection more than once. And in fact, Heather said it, not him. And they're still not saying it now in 2025. It's very disheartening. This is from a podcast a couple days ago, and then when his shirt changes to light brown, it's from like yesterday. And I'm just going to let these things play. I'm going to pause them, and I'm going to point out the absurdity of where this is in 2025. And unfortunately, I think this really means that Brett Weinstein as an operation or as a podcaster is pretty much about to be completely discredited with his own words. And I think it's just, if you keep it into context, that this is a guy that I've had intimate communication with for at least 3/4 of a year, during which I was briefly bamboozled by a lot of the people in that Signal chat who I also thought were good. It's remarkable where we are. So here is the first video where he is describing the health freedom movement and the difference between being a purist, which is somebody who just likes the truth and wants the real story, versus somebody who understands that politics is sort of a compromise, and some of the truth has to be sacrificed for the compromise that gets made in a political situation, aka, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. needs to compromise a little bit before he can get confirmed. So let's listen to this carefully.
So that we don't have to decide between going after food safety and going after pharma safety. We don't have to decide whether to sacrifice what we've learned about the COVID vaccines because the president has a particular amount of pride around the way they were brought to bear on the so-called pandemic. That the right way to deal with this is actually very simple. And I'm worried that the purists, who I understand, but the purists, people who've been focused on the factual questions surrounding safety and efficacy, surrounding the pandemic, how much threat there actually was from it, those people who have been focused on those things are not ready. In fact, many are unwilling to think in political terms because it's a compromise. They've got a very clear picture of what happened and then what it means.
Now, understand that this is basically what CHD has done to all the autism moms and all the people that have ever donated to them since their inception. Is that they've promised that they're going to do it, they're going to fight, but the way that they fight is that there's just got to be we just got to be free to say stuff. And that'll work fine. As long as we're free to say, that's what we're going to fight for. We're not going to have any specific goals. We're not going to have any specific ideas that we're going to speak out loud or targets that we're going to aim at, other than a big top tent of health freedom. And that is a political choice that is made in order to catch as many cats as possible. That's why they're talking about electromagnetic radiation. That's why they're talking about anything and everything to do with whatever they can care about as health freedom, and not landing anything. Not one touchdown, not one victory where, a product gets taken off the market like Miralax. Not one victory. Nothing. They have Brian Hooker, and they haven't got him across the finish line yet. They have a green book, and they don't sell it. They were selling the red book today on email, which is great for me, but not good for the truth. Go ahead, Brett. Keep shooting yourself in the foot, please.
And how much danger, how much harm. But the idea of stepping into a realm where you inherently have to compromise that story in order to reduce the harm going forward is anathema to them. So I'm worried that the purist...
And so he's talking about informed consent, and he's going to talk about informed consent, but from a political standpoint, you have to compromise the truth, which by definition isn't really informed consent now, is it? Do you see the controversy here? Do you see the bullshit level here? Do you see the absolute bullshit level? I don't think it's possible that somebody who is reasonably intelligent can say these words out loud and they not just grind together like broken gears. And yet he's saying them confidently and certainly. It's remarkable. I'm starting to change my mind. I'm wondering if he's not just fooled because he's not very sophisticated and really wants to believe that he is, because he says complex systems and evolution a lot. I don't know. I'm starting to really have pity for Brett, because this is the first video of 4, and by we get to the 4th one, boy, it's a oh my gosh, it's crazy.
Are going to kibosh anything that isn't their own perspective, and that their perspective can't work for all the reasons I've been pointing out. So here's my proposal. And again, I certainly am with the purists to the extent that we know the story. That's what I think is the right thing to do. But the way to deal with the political realities of this situation comes in 3 parts: informed consent and liability. And my point about this is, first of all, informed consent, as I've pointed out here many times, is a principle that is so deeply ingrained that after World War II, after Nuremberg, we literally hanged 7 doctors for violating this principle, even though it had not yet been codified. It is now formally codified in the Nuremberg Code, and we are now routinely violating it. We are not informing people about what it is that we are, in many cases, mandating that they take, and we are not allowing consent. We are strong-arming people into taking things that they shouldn't take, or that they should at least have the option not to take. So if we insist on informed consent across all domains, you have a right as a human being to decide what you will and what you will not accept. Now, the language of informed consent from Nuremberg specifically speaks to experimental treatments. I would argue that in light of complex systems, all of this stuff is experimental. Right.
In light of complex systems, all of this is experimental. This is the shallowness of his enchantment. He just throws complex systems in there, and he thinks he's, played a checkmate move where you can't really respond. He couldn't even tell you what complex systems means. And if he did, his explanation would not bring you any further, because that's not his goal. His goal is to bamboozle. He doesn't want to have questions. He wants you to presume he has the answers. Informed consent liability. Think about how he thought he was being so profound, and then in the next second he said informed consent with one finger. That's the charade that's happening here. It should be, in a way, kind of terrifying, because I don't think they ever intended to be acting this long, to be this far over their skis for this long, because it's going to get really ugly really fast. It got really ugly this week. They really went crazy on Sunday and on Monday as a result of these, I guess they saw a window of opportunity with respect to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s confirmation hearings.
Right? The fact that it takes decades to figure out that yellow number 5 or Ozempic or whatever it's going to be,
Bovier appeal,
has some negative effect, doesn't mean that that was just some shocking error. It means that in general, if you intervene in a complex system, you're going to discover down the road that you had consequences you did not anticipate, meaning that all of this stuff is inherently experimental.
And so what about intramuscular injection of a combination of substances, like toxins and biologics, like a protein? Is that intervening in a complex system in a relatively crafty way, like one of the best innovations in medical history? Because here is a would-be expert, a self-proclaimed expert, but actual jackass, saying that complex systems and something means that all of these things are experimental. What are all of these things? He's talking about the COVID vaccines, even though if he were to think logically about the consequences of his big ideas, it would mean that intramuscular injection of medicine in healthy people, never mind intramuscular injection in healthy children, is absurd. Keep going, Brett.
You're going to give it to people or farm animals or spray it on food or whatever. So, informed consent and liability starts with informed consent. That means we have to know what it is that we are going to be consuming. We have to be able to know where it is.
Consuming? Is that what you call intramuscular injection, Brett? Consuming? Think about what they're doing here, ladies and gentlemen. This is not clear, concise messaging that's trying to hit home runs and make sure that our grandchildren don't believe this bullshit. This is obfuscation and mixing things together, because he's about to talk about the Gates Foundation product appeal.
We have to be able to know what is known about it. We have to know what is not known about it. And we have to be able to say no. I want you to think about all of the problems that it would solve if we had agreement on that. Let's take appeal. I don't know where appeal is. I am told that it is in a brand of apple cider vinegar, organic apple cider vinegar, that we have been using. I don't know if that's just a vicious rumor, if that's really true, but the point is, I have a right to know if appeal is in that vinegar, and I have a right to say no. Right?
You also had a right to know, and Brett and Robert Malone and Steve Kirsch and others prevented you from knowing that transfection, that they were calling a COVID vaccine, an investigational vaccine, was in fact an old methodology that had already been known from years of use on the academic bench to be inappropriate as a therapy for healthy people. Inappropriate, like it would be criminal to use it on healthy people, but if you have cancer or something, go for it. That would be informed consent with respect to what happened during the rollout of the transfections. Informed consent would also entail the telling the truth about the fidelity or lack of fidelity of a single amplicon non-nested PCR diagnostic, which they're not going to do either. I waver. This seems pretty malevolent now. He's probably reading the script that he's given and reading it well.
You can't hide it from me by not putting it on the label, that's a violation of informed consent. Okay. mRNA. Okay, I know it's in those damn shots. I don't know what else is in them. I needed to know that there's an SV40 promoter in the shots because of the cell game that was played with the various production modalities. But I have a right to know where mRNA is, and that means not just the shots. I also have a right to know if you've inoculated a beef cow or some dairy cattle that I'm going to get meat or milk from. And I have a right to say no.
Yep.
Right? You have to tell me it's in there, and then I have a right to say no, and you don't get to belittle me for it.
Now, interestingly enough, I think it would be the USDA or the FDA that would be responsible for telling you what's in there. And so again, it's going to be really weird, but you're going to see it. There's a very big incongruency between their uniform agreement, the illusion of consensus that the FDA is bad, corrupt, and at the same time begging for someone to regulate things like the FDA only has the mandate to do. Regulating the label, regulating the statement safe and effective. And when you realize the history that is very simple to say, Brett Weinstein and Eric Weinstein's dad was the first intellectual property attorney to serve in the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice that he served in was Robert F. Kennedy's Department of Justice. Yes, John F. Kennedy's Department of Justice. You might start to see what's going on here because that's where the FDA formed. Senator Kefauver is a name you're never going to hear from any of these people, but you'll hear it from Mark. He's probably got a link on his website where you can find out about Senator Kefauver. That's a good piece of this puzzle to educate yourself on. As a biology coach, I suggest you go there. Go ahead, Brett. Keep going.
For exercising that right. You don't get to tell me, but the science says this or that. I'm a human being. I was born with the right not to eat stuff that I don't want to eat, and that means you have to tell me
fancy days.
Where it is.
Damn.
Okay? So if we had informed consent and liability, then that would cover all of the cases across pharma and food. You tell me what's in it. I tell you whether or not I accept it. You don't get to question my judgment.
That is the FDA. That's the FDA. It's so funny that the FDA was formed by his father and the father of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It's so funny that they're not going to say FDA.
Right? Mm-hmm. That's effectively almost everything the purists would want, but in a form that the libertarians can accept, and a form that President Trump can accept. All right. The third part, so informed consent is two parts. The third part is liability. Now
Wait, I'm sorry, I'm confused then. I thought informed consent and liability were the first two parts.
No, informed consent and liability. Informed, I need to know
what
it is. I need to get to say no. And then liability. The manufacturer has to be liable.
And so now he's separated informed and consent, even though the legal definition of informed consent is exactly the ability to say no. You're supposed to be informed, and you're supposed to be able to say no. That's what informed consent means. It's not two things. You can go to the Balfour Declaration and find that out. Can you believe this shit?
Liable in a normal sense in court for harm done to me. Okay? That, if you think about what it is that is supposed to make us safe, our system is supposed to be made safe by testing that happens before stuff emerges into the market. And then you're supposed to be able to force that testing to be high quality because the manufacturer doesn't want to be caught having done a poor quality safety test. And
he's talking about the FDA without saying the FDA. Why is he doing that?
And then facing you in court after they've injured you. That is what makes the system work. The removal of that by the Reagan administration for vaccines has created a landscape in which pharma does not have the normal incentives to avoid harming you. In fact, it came to my attention this week. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it, but the fact that there is no liability for these things actually gives an incentive for the manufacturer to not discover harms.
Oh, you just thought of this week? You just thought of that this week.
Right? They are actually incentivized not to do the safety testing that they would do for another pharmaceutical because they don't want to know.
I mean, I don't know. Does it anger you at all that this fool is allowed to masquerade as some thinker? On YouTube, on social media, he's allowed to go around on stage and say that he was censored and it wasn't fair. He's allowed to masquerade as part of this new populist unity movement when he's such a catastrophic moron.
If they had liability, they would want to know because they don't want to get caught having done harm that they're then going to pay billions of.
It's not just liability. Make sure you understand that the legal term in America is strict liability, and it's most likely that this dunce is reading a script that he doesn't even understand, even though it's his father definitely understands.
Dollars for in court. So, informed consent and liability would restore a system that works. It would allow anybody
next video
believes they
I interpret it as I internalize it, I still understand it, is pathogens exist. External forces, evolution exists. There will be pathogens out there that have an interest in colonizing a body and making parts of that body do what is in its interest as opposed to the body's interests. And that remains intact in my head as what germ theory of disease is. It's an honorable approach to understanding some disease, but when it is taken to this sort of
I'd like to remind you that it was in 2022 that Kevin McCairn and Mark Bailey enacted a very, in retrospect, ridiculous argument about whether there are viruses or not viruses, and the germ theory versus terrain theory. And 2.5 years later, we have the intellectual dark web intellectual champions, married couple Brett and Heather Weinstein, talking about germ versus terrain theory. The same thing that Kevin McCairn was convinced needed to be opposed, and the person who was most expounding on it was Andy Kaufman and Tom Cowan and the Baileys. So Kevin McCairn, at the beginning of the pandemic, already in March of 2020, knew that we had to oppose people who didn't think there was a real virus, like Andy Kaufman and Tom Cowan and the Baileys in New Zealand. And now, 5 years later, that exact same bullshit discussion with those exact bullshit talking points is now being reiterated and read as if they're, on the cutting edge by the Weinsteins.
Logical fallacy endpoint of, therefore, the only thing to do if you have a disease for which there is a germ, a pathogen, is focus on eradicating the pathogen, is an absurd obstruction of what should be understood when you say.
So eradicating the pathogen is an absurd idea. Does she realize that she's sitting across from a jackass who in 2021, in June of 2021, with a guy by the name of Robert Wallace Malone and a guy by the name of Stephen Kirsch, sat together and said that if they could just force everybody to take ivermectin and celecoxib, that we would reach zero COVID and the whole pandemic would be over? Is this dipshit going to sit there and not cop to that? Not say, well, I was pretty convinced for a couple years that zero COVID was possible. Nope. But right now she says, well, you know, the ecology of these complex systems means that getting rid of any particular pathogen is just a silly idea.
Stop lying!
Oh my gosh, it's just gross.
Actually, pathogens are real, and it is useful to understand the ecology of pathogens as much as possible.
Yes, it's a caricature of the germ theory of disease.
Yep.
Germ theory.
These people are caricatures of what it means to be a biologist. Caricatures of it. Caricatures of what it means to be a awakened academic biologist. It's just fantastic.
Disease inherently, if it is at all sophisticated, includes terrain theory or miasma theory.
Right.
Putting the black book out there right now, The Real Anthony Fauci. I think they should be promoting this book myself. That is The Wuhan Cover-Up in the Terrifying Bioweapons Arm Race by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I love this book. Buy this book. Share it with your family and friends.
And, well, I did want to recover. The thing is, even if you count the polio question strictly in terms of polio, you still have to be in favor of the making the gut healthy response, because the pharmaceutical in question, the polio shot, causes a certain number of cases of polio. And so even if your point is you're obsessed with polio, it's still the wrong approach to go after trying to amp up the immune system so it spots this pathogen. The problem is, how did the pathogen get to the place that it causes the paralysis in the first place?
Are you hearing it? He's talking about the arrangement of the immune system, and he's so dense he doesn't even realize it. He's actually almost there. He's going to almost rationalize it right out loud. He's actually going to say it. You never know.
Right. So if we think about, you know, as you point out, there are lots of other diseases that maybe don't involve, that aren't relevant to this dyadic framing at all. But infectious disease and chronic disease, broadly understood as mapping onto germ theory of disease, on terrain theory of disease.
So chronic disease maps on terrain, and infectious disease wraps on germ theory. That's interesting. I'm not going to let her go on because I've got 2 more videos and I want to get done before 2. Just check this next one out.
Let's.
This one's important.
The polio story makes that point so clearly, in the sense that, yeah, there's a virus, and it does cause many of the cases of polio. Therefore, you can create an entire career's worth of projects to do, thinking about how to disrupt the polio virus so that it cannot paralyze children, only to discover that actually the virus in question really is close to harmless, except for the disruption of the body's ability to keep it confined to where it usually thrives, in the gut. Mm-hmm. And so the point is, you would expect an honest system that was really hell-bent on dealing with polio to become obsessed with the breaches in the gut and to lose interest in the virus itself because it's not worth controlling it.
Now, make no mistake about it. When I was in a Signal chat with Brett Weinstein in 2021, starting in August, I explained to him that the reason why transfection doesn't work is because your immune system is oriented in such a way that when it sees something foreign on the inside, it gets rid of it completely. And in that process, can make mistakes and cause autoimmunity. We don't understand how it works, but we definitely understand that it can happen when we transfect an animal. We know that from the academic bench. I also explained to him that the immune system is oriented from the inside out, such that you can understand it that way and understand why intramuscular injection would be so ridiculous. So again, I have drawn this picture many times for my audience, but I'm going to do it one more time. Again, if you draw a simplified version of the human body as a tube, and the human body is just this thing here with a tube where the food goes in this side, and it comes out this side, right? And so he's talking about the gut and about how polio is here, but it only causes polio if it breaches the gut, if it gets across the gut. Well, interestingly, that's my argument for why intramuscular injection of any substance with the intent of augmenting the immune system is dumb, because the immune system is oriented from the inside out, and more importantly, it is oriented around the maintenance of a barrier, the patrol of a barrier that extends into the lungs and along the gut and in all of these places, including the skin on the outside, including the mucus lining of the gut. And so as Brett pretends to wax intellectual, he trips over his own you-know-what, as he seemingly seems to explain how the immune system works without logically thinking of the consequences of it. A couple times now. And here he is explaining that the polio is a real virus, but it's pretty much a nothing until you breach the gut wall. Let's see if he can keep going here.
And I mean, and not only is it not worth controlling it, if a healthy gut can reduce the threat from the polio, sorry, what kind of a pathogen is it? Virus, to near zero.
She didn't even know it was a virus. That's fantastic. So here we go. Now she's talking about the microbiome. And so again, as a rudimentary biology lesson, just let's make sure you understand that not only is the barrier to the rest of your body from the inside out, the barrier is epithelial cells, but on the surface of those epithelial cells in your gut and on your skin and in the lining of your lungs, the mucosal of your lungs, there are bacteria. Those bacteria have phages. Those bacteria give phages to each other. They produce phages, and all of those signals involve DNA and RNA and protein production and symbiotic and non-symbiotic relationships between our body and those bacteria. But if those bacteria that are living friendly on your skin over here are suddenly put into your body by a puncture, this is not good. And in the pioneer days, if you were to get a stick, stuck in your guts and then pulled back out again, and that stick had enough, bacteria or other things on it, or there was enough bacteria on your skin, you weren't going to recover from that injury. You were going to go septic and you were going to die. The breaching of the barrier and the microbiota getting inside of your body past the barrier is one of the easiest ways to get sepsis. And so understand again that these people aren't revealing an expertise. They're actually revealing a striking level of naivety, where they are purporting to be the experts in the room because they keep repeating complex systems, but then they go on to explain some very fundamental elements of that complex system without even being able to have a light bulb go on that says, whoa, wait a minute. I think I heard this before from JJCouey about 4 years ago. Because it's their job not to. Their handlers are relying on them not doing it.
And any intervention, any pharmaceutical intervention will have costs, will have side effects in some people at least. Why would we try to get mass exposure to the pharmaceutical when instead we could get
Listen to how carefully they're not saying anything. It's remarkable. What is the pharmaceutical?
Masses to have healthier guts, which is also going to have additional downstream positive effects of making them less susceptible to the other diseases that we have.
It's going to have side effects which are positive, like vitamin D, using vitamin D.
Not the vaccine.
Rat poison.
Making the gut healthy has side effects that are all positive. And so, yes, and I had something else. I've lost it. I'll come back to it.
So Kennedy in The Real Anthony Fauci.
Next video.
Preservation techniques that disrupt the ecology of the creature that's hostile to you.
So they're going to say in this video a lot, they say ecology of the virus, because they consider themselves evolutionary ecologists. And so anytime they can make it seem like ecology, that's great. But remember, my argument is that RNA or an RNA virus is not a pattern integrity. So it's not participating in or a component of an ecology. That's just dumb. But that's exactly what the Human Genome Project and the NIH and the DOD and DARPA and everybody would love you to believe, that RNA can pandemic all by itself, and that RNA viruses constitute a real functioning unit of the ecology of everyone. And that's just absurd.
Are actually extensions of something that biology gave us that didn't involve any specific behavior. So our stomachs are highly acidic because basically any extreme environment is a challenge to anything that lives in a normal environment. So by creating...
Our stomachs are acidic, not to digest food or process materials for intake, but it's to keep the bad guys out. Wow, what a charlatan.
A really low pH environment. Anything you've taken in that's capable of making you sick has an immediate challenge that it has a huge problem solving. So anyway, disrupting ecology is a key to remaining
disrupting ecology. And and in the case, just since we've gone down this path, and I don't want to pull us back and simplify again, but when you're talking about food, milk in non-human nature, milk doesn't exist outside of a body for at all, really. Like,
Yep.
It goes directly from the mother's teat to inside the baby, and,
Yep.
and that's it. So humans have created ways of preserving milk outside of a body for a very long time.
Humans have created ways of preserving milk outside of the body. Now, you're about to witness one of the most catastrophic failures of a biologist on film ever captured. BBC has never captured footage like this. The World Wildlife Fund has never captured footage nobody's captured footage like this. Ansel Adams and anybody that's a photographer or a videographer, no one's ever captured such a magnificent intellectual failure as this. What you have here is a scripted transition from whatever the hell they were talking about a minute ago to discussing the product Appeal again. Appeal is a chemically applied something that is put on fruit so that it doesn't bruise or some other shit, and it lasts long enough to reach your table. And it's a Bill Gates product that's not tested apparently, so everybody's got to get mad about it. Now, irrespective of the good or bad qualities of Appeal, I would assume it's bad. Why would I want something sprayed on my apples? Of course I don't want it, but that's irrelevant. What you need to see here is the script that these people have been either provided by or written for themselves in order to seamlessly transition into a discussion about Appeal will reiterate the magnificence of my argument. It will reiterate the magnificence of the argument that the immune system, when simply drawn, is oriented from the inside out and occupies a barrier. And that it is breaching that barrier that we must avoid at all costs. An intramuscular injection in order to augment that system oriented to those barriers is absurd. So let's listen to what she says and how she says it to see if you think that she has shot herself in the foot as directly as I think she has. I think that this is essentially the end of their credibility, because this is just so ham-fisted. Remember my argument. Remember that I am arguing that intramuscular injection in general is dumb, and that any doctor who sat down and thought about it should be able to reach this conclusion. Any immunologist with a breadth and depth of knowledge of immunology should definitely understand what I'm saying. And yet somehow or another here, in all their waxing intellectual about the importance of the gut microbiome and good food, have not been able to reach the conclusion, the basic literacy of the immune system that I tried to give them over a Signal chat almost 4 full years ago. That's how malevolent these people and their following of their given script is. They are traitors to our grandchildren.
And as soon as that exists, there is going to be other ecologies out there, other organisms out there who have ecologies of their own, who have interest inside the baby, and that's it. So humans have created ways of preserving milk outside of a body for a very long time. And as soon as that exists, there is going to be other ecologies out there, other organisms out there who have ecologies of their own, who have interests of their own, who want to take advantage of that incredible nutrition source. Similarly, an apple on its own, without having a scar in it or a puncture or something, is able to exist for quite a while without rotting. But as soon as it has any breach in its skin, effectively, then there will be bacteria, fungus, spore, like whatever, things from the air that are interested in getting into what was protected, the inside of the apple. And that will happen pretty quickly.
Wow. It's almost like she understands how the immune system might work, except she doesn't realize that the immune system works exactly like an apple peel. The immune system works exactly like an apple peel, only it's a hell of a lot more complicated. It's a complex system. I mean, that's just magnificent.
And so you now have high-tech solutions like a peel, which we have talked about, the Bill Gates in part funded coating.
What about, let's say we do this. Why don't we inject into the apple something that will keep it from rotting? Do you think that would be a better idea, Heather? Maybe we could inject a combination of substances into the core of the apple, and that would help the apple not rot. Maybe that's a better idea. It is remarkable that these people can be talking to a camera, saying these words in succession, and not have some gears turn which make them realize, oh my gosh, how much of a fool have I been for 5 years plus? I hesitate to say this out loud, but I don't think it's possible. I don't think my 12-year-old son could read this script and not pause and look up and say, wow, Dad, wait a minute. And yet somehow or another, she's reading off of her script, promoting their books, and she's not going to realize it. And I don't know if Brett realizes it, but he doesn't look very comfortable with this apple analogy.
That is allowed an apple on its own, without having a scar in it or a puncture or something, is able to exist for quite a while without rotting. But as soon as it has any breach in its skin, effectively, then there will be bacteria, fungus, spore, like whatever, things from the air that are interested in getting into what was protected, the inside of the apple. And that will happen pretty quickly. And so you now have high-tech solutions like a peel, which we have talked about, the Bill Gates in part funded coating that is allowed to be put even on organic fruits, which preserves their appearance without necessarily and probably not preserving in any way the nutritional quality.
Somehow she's got to believe she's doing what she's supposed to do, that she's fighting for the right thing, that she's arguing and asking the right questions. But man, look at that guy's face.
Or their taste, but you can no longer tell from the outside how long that fruit has spent off the tree. Whereas
Ladies and gentlemen, it's for all the marbles. Worst case scenario, the team worst case scenario, they got us here. They got us here just like she got us here in 2020, just like she got us here after the Boston bombing. It's easy to see her. It's easy to see her when she comes back after 5 years talking about the bird flu, that you don't have to listen to her, that she's obviously reading a script. It's harder to see it and accept the fact that Polly and Brian are also reading the same script, talking about milk, just like Brett and Heather were talking about milk before she talked about apples. And even if you don't see it like this, just understand that I'm coming to you very humbly, having tried to get their attention over the last 5 years, trying to get their attention and having succeeded, having months to have talked to them about this and explain it to them and have them shake their head and tell me how important these ideas are, and then go on to ignore me, my work, my family, my contributions to this book, and go on as if I don't exist, which I guess is fine. Except they're working for the slavers, the very ones that want to enslave our grandkids. And they're doing it by creating this illusion of consensus on social media about what RNA can or can't do. It has been a terribly strange trip. And I've lost at least one best friend down here to the shots because he wouldn't believe me. I couldn't effectively communicate it to him because these people had been messing with me, making me believe that I was a hero in the Scooby-Doo mystery solving exercise of the lab leak. Team worst case scenario is the best way to describe them because very early on in the pandemic, that's what they all agreed on, that the worst case scenario is pretty bad. And team worst case scenario became most visible to me in November of 2023 after everybody was ignoring my revelations about clones. And then these people all got together in Romania, of all places. Meryl Nass, Jill Glass-Poole Malone, Robert Malone, Raymond Cole, Brett Weinstein, Stephen Hatfield, Nick Hudson, Jessica Rose, Harvey Reich, Byron Bridle, and Denny Rancor. And probably more of them are going along with it unknowingly, but a lot of those same people showed up a few months later in front of the Senate and regurgitated all the same nonsense. And they then included Kevin McKernan, one of my personal, like Brett Weinstein, one of my personal clown cars, my personal long-time nemesis now. These people know me. They've known me for years. They're ignoring me because I finally figured it out. The team worst-case scenario was just running out the clock on the murder so that the idea of a novel virus would be accepted, the idea of tracking it with PCR would be accepted, the idea of having 18 million sequences and that representing the ongoing evolution of an endemic signal needed to be accepted, and that's why they let no one else but the Human Genome Project Research and Development Director maintain and curate that narrative from 2020 onward. Countless podcasts curating the narrative about PCR working, but just not there, setting the narrative trap, and it's still the same narrative that he's telling now. That's how you can see it. He hasn't learned a thing. Nobody in the health freedom movement that has any noticeable presence on social media has learned anything, except that worst case scenario could come again. And my message is very clear that the team worst case scenario was put in place to seed the narrative about the virus to contain the expected outcomes of transfection that they would call an investigational vaccine. And they did that with the stories of the fear and cleavage site and the spike protein and the HIV inserts, when in reality, they were also talking about cardiac damage and mitochondrial damage and amyloid and long COVID, all expected. And that's why they won't tell you that AI is also a medical device if it's used for medicine. And so the FDA also has to regulate that. And just like Kevin McKernan said on the Vance Crowe podcast in 2020, the FDA is sure in the way. Because the FDA could also just get rid of all PCR as a diagnostic in one move. say that it's a medical device that's unproven, but they won't, because Team Worst Case Scenario is on the case. They are preventing it from happening. They are also preventing from anybody from realizing that synthetic recombinant genetics, how biologics are made, are the only thing they've got, and that alone, on a background, if they just made a large quantity and then put it somewhere, they could use that synthetic recombinant pure signal to convert a background to evidence of spread using their own proprietary PCR tests. And they would do it if they wanted everybody to believe that transfectin worked. But how could they get away with it if transfection is so deadly, like I say? Well, they got away with it by rolling out a mass amount of placebo and then putting members of Team Kevin McKernan and Robert Malone's team on social media saying that there were hot batches and cold batches, or batches that were treated right and batches that weren't. And it covers up the known way that they got it out. And that's why Kevin McKernan is on big podcasts now, making sure that everybody understands that COVID is endemic, that it went from a mud puddle here to everywhere over here. And that is a biological mythology, a biological lie you cannot teach your children. If you do, they will be enslaved by it. RNA cannot pandemic, ladies and gentlemen. We've had 5 years to figure it out. They've had 15 years to say RNA cannot pandemic, or intramuscular injection is dumb, or transfecting healthy people is a crime, or that the population pyramid was a problem they were going to take advantage of, and they didn't say it. Thank you very much for being here, ladies and gentlemen. This has been Gigaohm Biological, a high-resistance, low-noise information brief brought to you by a biologist. I'll see you again tomorrow. You can find me at these websites. Thank you very much for thinking about supporting, and if you want to support, you go to this last one, gigaohmbiological.com, and that'll work just fine. Thanks for being here. I'll see you guys again tomorrow.
I have no responsibility for the current pandemic.
Stop lying!